right, so the Bloominar Series is a free online series devoted to nourishment, true nourishment of the body, mind, and soul. And it is a co-creation between Madonna and I. Are those? And we want to express our sincerest gratitude to everybody who's on the call. We know what it takes to make time to join and create space in your life for something like this. So gratitude is the fairest blossom which springs from the soul, and we are so grateful that you're all here. So welcome to today's Bloominar. The topic is food and mood, the intuitive connection. And we're so excited to have Mekenzie Smith. She's our guest presenter. And she is in full-time practice at Walden Behavioral Care, which is an eating disorder program, Boston-based, technically Waltham, but they have sites all over New England now. And she is also in private practice in Boston, actually at my office space. So she is seeing clients there in private practice on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Of course, right now with the physical distancing requirements with the COVID-19, she's seeing people remotely. So, but she'll say more about herself later, but we're really excited to have her. And Madonna and I are the co-creators of the Bloom series. So I'm Maria Milano. I'm a wellness practitioner and a psychodramatist based in Boston. Madonna?
And I'm Madonna Murphy, and as some of you know, and I'm a corporate finance accountant, working contract at the moment, but definitely more interested in pursuing a creative and spirit-led life. So that's why I'm here with Maria.
Yay, and we're so happy to have you all.
Yeah.
Okay. So great. So we also wanted to introduce something that we're so excited about. Madonna and I have been co-creating a Bloom a Life You Love program. So coming soon to a garden near you is what we wrote. And, you know, the Bloominars really bloomed out of the Bloom a Life You Love program development we've been doing. And we just saw a need for this. And it's been so, I think really, it's been very nourishing for me personally to be able to offer these as a way of being of service and as a way of helping people connect intuitively to themselves. So, and then the slide on the right is just a little bit of a snapshot of the program that we're creating, which will take people through a journey of eventually really embodying heartful space. So we'll say more about that later, but we just wanted to introduce it.
Great.
All right, so legal disclaimer. This online event will be recorded using audio and video Zoom technology and may be shared at a later time. So please know that by attending this event, you agree to any of your statements, questions, or physical likeness being recorded. And if you do not agree with this, please adjust your participation so that you feel comfortable, or you can also excuse yourself from the call and obtain a recording of the presentation later. And by adjusting participation, you can hide your self-view, you know, in other words, inactivate your video so that your likeness isn't shown, or you can self-monitor the kinds of questions that you ask. So confidentiality expectations. This online event will include people sharing about their personal experiences and also asking questions. So please know that by attending or watching this event, we expect that all attendees respect the privacy of all other attendees by not sharing, discussing, or distributing the content with anyone or anywhere, especially social media. So if you're not in agreement with this, again, please excuse yourself from the call. Although we don't want you to do that, but we just really want to be very clear about confidentiality. All right.
Okay.
So housekeeping, Madonna.
So, yep, I'll just let you all know that we'll keep everybody on mute during the presentation. So I'll mute you all very soon. We'll take you off so you can share or ask questions at the end. If you have any questions during the call, by all means, add them to the chat box at the bottom, and make sure that you select everyone for that. And Maria and I will basically be monitoring those questions, and we'll find a time to raise them during the presentation. Otherwise, there is a raise your hand feature through Zoom as well. Okay, thank you.
Right, so meditation ABC. So we just want to invite you right now just to do a basic practice, simply allowing your breath to flow and being with that flow. So just take a moment to connect with your feet, with your body being supported by wherever you're seated, maybe a sofa, maybe a chair. And just allow yourself to feel the support that's there for you. and tune in with your breath. And for the next minute, we're going to create a container together. And just take a moment and think about, what quality of self could I use right now in my life? Curiosity, calm, confidence, compassion, clarity, creativity, courage, and connectedness. So just take a moment, allowing your breath. And for the next minute, we want to invite you to call in whatever quality of self you feel like you need right now as you notice your breath. And you can close your eyes or you can keep them open, whatever feels comfortable. And begin to imagine, as we're all calling in these qualities of self, begin to imagine creating a container that we're co-creating together for this experience today. Good, and just go ahead and finish with a couple very deep belly breaths. Just take them at your own pace. Deep belly breath and full exhale. And then deep belly breath and full exhale. Beautiful. And take a moment to, again, offer gratitude and appreciation to yourself for making this time for self-care. All right. Good. So go ahead and open your eyes if they were closed and come back into the space that we're creating together. But we're going to hear a personal practice sharing by Haley Bean. She's going to be talking with us about how she in her own life and in her own space has, in the context of struggling as well with what we're all struggling with COVID-19 and the sheltering at home, and in the context of struggling with that and a reemergence of struggles in her relationship with food and body, she created this altar, this space for herself to use to help her through this time, to help her realign and to help her connect with her intentions for her life to be her best self. And she's going to share with us more about that practice. And Haley can say a little bit more about it as well, but I'm going to go ahead and pass it to her.
All right. Well, hi, everybody. I'm Haley.
Hi.
So I'm sure I'm not alone in that quarantine has brought up some unhealthy coping mechanisms, being stuck in the house and just being so overwhelmed and anxious all the time. So I've been turning to a lot of some old ways of regrounding, and then some new things have emerged too, just to deal with everything that's come up from quarantine. So there's this one story or metaphor that I've always connected with, and it's found its way back into my life in the past few weeks, called The Bowl of Light. And I know this story from a song by one of my favorite artists, Trevor Hall. But the story is originally a Hawaiian legend. And it's basically that we all start out our life with a bowl of light, and the bowl is representative of your vessel, your physical and spiritual vessel. And you start off with it radiating full of light, and then as you go through your days, it starts to become full of stones, and those stones are negativity, fears, judgments, and they just start to pile up, and they're physically blocking that light, so you can no longer see or feel that light radiating from your bowl. But the point of the story is that it's a bowl, right? So it's open, so you can always tip the bowl and empty the stones to be able to see the light again. And I just think this is the most beautiful image, and I've always been strongly pulled towards it. And recently I wanted to create some sort of physical manifestation of this bowl of light rather than just listening to the song or thinking of the story. And I love candles, so of course I had to incorporate candles. So I created this, let me see, can I flip my camera? Yeah. Little space here where I have my candles, and they're physically blocked by stones. So I have this big one with all these little pebbles, and then these little tea lights with these special stones as well. And I have this practice of every day physically tipping the candle and pouring the stones out, or taking these off and then lighting the tea candles. And along with that, I have certain mantras and intentions that I turn to with this altar. And most of the stones for me are representative of some unhealthy eating habits or poor relationships that I have with food. And it's a really useful connection to have this physical space to connect these mantras and intentions that I have to my physical space. So let me rephrase that. So typically I'll come up with an intention of something I want to change about my eating habits, or I noticed something that feels unhealthy, doesn't feel good, and I note it in my journal, and then comes time for the next meal or the next day, and it just feels disconnected. It's like, oh yeah, that happened, it's over, new day. But having this space to reconnect to those intentions and those mantras right before eating a meal or right in the morning is a really helpful physical manifestation to reconnect me to those intentions and those mantras. So that's been very helpful. And one of the stones, actually labeled, a lot of them with these little labels, that I connect with the most right now, it's actually labeled with the word addiction, which I know that word has a lot of connotations, but to me, I think of addiction as, just some sort of unhealthy relationship with a substance, which for me can be food a lot of the time. And it really comes through as this ego forward sense of just food and eating having this control and power over my life in an unhealthy way. And so I've turned a lot to the phrase breaking ties with addiction. And that's been my mantra that I've been connecting to as I light these candles and remove these stones. But then last week, Maria asked me the very important question of what does breaking ties with addiction allow for? And I had never thought about that. I just thought about the fact that I wanted to break ties with it. And I didn't think of all the positivity that could come from the results of that. So the biggest thing I thought of was that breaking ties with addiction, or with whatever your stone is, allows for space, both in my head and in my soul, just to live more soul forward instead of ego forward, with this feeling like this external force has control over me. But instead of that, really focusing on living soul first, which is an expression I use frequently, and having that space to see all this time and effort and energy that I spend thinking about food and eating, what could that energy and effort go towards if it's not all funneling towards this one place? What is all this potential? What can it do when I allow myself to have that space? It's not being filled by this addiction. So what I've learned from this whole altar setup is really not only should we focus on not carrying stones in our bowl of light, but identifying what those stones are. I physically labeled them, and what they are, what do they mean, where do they come from? And then some concrete changes you can make in your life. Like for me, even the small notion of just lighting these candles before a meal and reconnecting with my intention can be so helpful to connect that spiritual side with the physical act of eating. So that little change is my way of tipping the bowl and getting that stone out of the bowl. And then the most important thing is really focusing on the light that can come once the stones are removed, you know, rather than just saying, I need to get this negative thing out of my bowl of light. That's not really the greatest motivation, as when you focus on what is this beautiful positive thing that will be shining through when this stone removes, you know, that light is a lot more motivating. So yeah, that's about it.
Thank you, Haley. That was beautiful. So beautiful. I love living soul first. And I want to invite everyone right now in this moment, before Mekenzie starts to share, to think about what Haley was sharing and think in your own life, identifying what is a stone. There may be many, but in this moment, identify what's a stone, what's a prominent stone. And if you do have some art supplies, you can draw a picture of it or them. And Haley noted how helpful it is to label the stone. So if you can label it, that would be great. And this is obviously something you can continue to do on your own as well after the call. And then the step 2 of that is thinking about what concrete change in your life you might want to make in relationship to that stone and what light can come from that. So as you're listening to Mekenzie's presentation, which will be on food, mood, and the intuitive connection with lots of fun science blended in, you can continue to think about identifying, maybe understanding more deeply the stone you already identified, or identifying maybe more and putting them into your image. And then thinking about the concrete change you might want to make in relationship to that. And then we'll go from there. In terms of the light, we'll do that at the end. Yeah, so maybe just take a moment to pause with that before we transition to Mekenzie. And again, Haley, thank you so much. That was so beautiful. Food and mood, the intuitive connection with Mekenzie. And I'm just going to hand it over because you're going to say a little bit about yourself. And again, please use the chat box because we will be watching for questions, and Mekenzie's really happy to answer them. So, all right.
Okay, thank you. Can everyone hear
You.
me? Can we just get like a nod? Yeah, okay, thank you. So yeah, thanks for having me today. I'm really excited to present. I'm going to be talking about food and mood, as well as a little bit about how different nutrients kind of affect our brains, and also relating that just to intuitive eating a bit as well. So I'm going to start just by sharing a little bit about myself and what brought me to this field. Then I'll talk a little bit more generally just about the connection between food and mood. And then I think I'm going to get more into the specifics of some nutrition science. We'll start with like the macronutrients, like our proteins, our carbs, our fats, then we can get even more micro and talk about some vitamins and minerals and how those play a role as well. So I am a registered dietitian. I grew up in a house with a dad who is a psychiatrist and a mom who is a psychologist. So I grew up just kind of in the space of mental health, always kind of knew that I wanted to do something to be in a helping profession. I wasn't sure exactly what that was going to be, but I always knew that I wanted to just be helping others. So I started college as a psych major, just kind of following in my parents' footsteps. And then I took a class in nutrition, and I was like, wow, this is really everything that I am interested in. I'm super passionate about food and how it affects our bodies, how it affects our minds, all of that. So I switched my major to dietetics and started to pursue a career in nutrition and dietetics. And everyone in that field is required to do an internship where they go through a whole bunch of different rotations and learn about clinical nutrition, outpatient nutrition. And I kind of got a little bit discouraged during that internship about the field that I went into, mostly because my outpatient rotation was in a bariatric surgery clinic, and I was really counseling people on weight loss. I was specifically counseling people for the medical weight loss trajectory, which meant using medications to aid in weight loss. And I just found it to be something that I didn't really believe in. I felt like I was talking to my patients and they weren't resonating with what I was saying. It wasn't working for them. Some people would come back and maybe they had lost a couple of pounds, but maybe they were like super miserable and they were, you know, like restricting their intake. And it wasn't something that I felt good about at all. Talking about patients with, you know, a real firm goal of weight loss. So I left my internship feeling a little bit discouraged and thinking about what I could do in the field of nutrition to kind of like serve what I liked. And that led me to the field of eating disorders. So right now, my full-time job is working at Walden Behavioral Care, which is an eating disorder center. I work on the inpatient unit. So that is the highest level of eating disorder care. The people that come in there are medically compromised from their eating disorder. So I've seen the sickest of the sick from eating disorders, and it's really given me an appreciation of what food can do to someone, and how a negative relationship with food can really, really affect people in such a harmful way. So I definitely practice from a standpoint of like no bad foods, all foods are great, really trying to, you know, be inclusive. And at the same time, I really enjoy the science behind nutrition and trying to help people eat foods that are going to make them feel great, both physically and mentally. So that's kind of where this presentation is coming from, because that seems to be a conversation that I have a lot with my clients. It's like, how can you really eat to make yourself feel good? Sorry. So when I think about eating to make myself feel good or make yourself feel good, I think about a couple of things. I think about eating foods that give you joy. I think about eating foods that give you energy, eating to support your physical health, and eating to support your mental health. So that first thing that I mentioned, eating foods that give you joy, I think of kind of some of the talks that Melissa has given on intuitive eating, and really trying to choose foods that you know are going to be satisfying for you, choosing foods that you really like and that you want to eat, and not just choosing foods because maybe there's some sort of like diet belief behind it that it's the right thing to eat in that moment. So making sure that first and foremost, when you're making a decision around food, it's something that you actually want to have. I think that's really important when it comes to food choices, and food and mood specifically. The next thing that I mentioned was eating to give yourself energy. So I think sometimes this can be more from like an intuitive eating perspective and thinking about how specific foods have made you feel in the past. So maybe there's been a time where you've eaten, let's say like a salad for lunch, and then a couple hours later you're feeling really low and like, I didn't get enough. Or maybe there's times when you've eaten, let's say like a big slice of pizza for lunch and you're feeling really sluggish after. So just trying to remind yourself of the feelings that you have after you have meals and how that might relate to what you want to choose to eat in that moment. And this also relates to something that I like to talk about with clients, which is blood sugar control, and trying to keep yourself at this baseline level that keeps your mood good and your energy good. So I'm going to try here to share my screen with you all and draw a little visual that I like to use with clients to kind of show what I mean by this. So just give me a second here. Okay. So I like to think of this as like, oops, sorry, it's supposed to be a straight line. Can everyone see this? The whiteboard? Yeah, okay. So I like to think of this line as like your baseline blood sugar and where your body wants to be in terms of feeling nourished, feeling good energy-wise, feeling good mentally. So this is where your body wants to be, right? And sometimes we wake up and maybe we are busy in the morning. We don't have time to eat breakfast right away. And our blood sugars can kind of drop below this line. And sometimes when we get below this line, what happens is we just feel ravenous. We feel like angry because we're hungry. And we just reach for whatever might be quickest, whatever might be right there. So a lot of times that ends up being these quick carbohydrate foods. So it could be like a bagel, or a muffin or a donut or something like that. And what happens when we tend to reach for these carbohydrate dense foods, our blood sugar goes up above this level really quickly. And then it falls again really quickly as well. So then we get back to this low point where we're again feeling hungry, feeling ravenous, and we kind of choose those same carbohydrate rich foods, and it ends up in a cycle like this. And when we're eating, we want to try to make choices that don't give us that up and down. So we want to try, I'll redraw this diagram at how we want to try to skew our eating towards. So we want to try and listen to our body and listen to the cues that are coming a little bit before we get to that really ravenous state where we're feeling hungry and we're feeling maybe even like moody because we're so hungry. So that might be like we just get a little bit below this. And then the food choices that I like to recommend to clients to make are to try and combine our carbohydrate foods with a protein or with a fat. So that might be like having your English muffin with some peanut butter on it, or having your bagel with some cream cheese on it. Just having something that combines that so that our blood sugars, they rise a little bit slower and they come down a little bit slower, because it takes our body longer to digest those foods that aren't just pure carbs. And that can kind of help with our mood overall, like less, high highs and less low lows. So that's one thing that I like to talk about, and I think about a lot with choosing foods to help keep our energy level stable, as well as our mood a little bit more stable. I'm going to stop sharing the screen. So I like using that visual because I think it can be helpful to kind of understand what I'm talking about with blood sugars. And that's also kind of leads me into something else to talk about, which is, a lot of times these food choices and trying to make the appropriate food choices can be more stressful than it's worth too. So when we're thinking about eating to support our mental health, if it's too stressful to find the fat to pair with the starch to keep that blood sugar in control, it's okay to just have whatever it is that you have available. So also just forgiving yourself for, whatever food choice makes sense in the moment. Because overall, we want to, forgive ourselves for what we're doing. Eating is not perfect. It's not meant to be perfect. But that is just a little tip that I like to share, is trying to, keep ourselves within that window where we're not feeling super ravenous, or we're not feeling like we just ate something that's pure carb and then we're going to feel super ravenous again in a couple hours or an hour. The other thing that I mentioned was eating to support your physical health. And a lot of times when I think about this, I think about making sure that you're getting enough nutrition throughout the day. A lot of times I find that people tend to undereat, and that's harmful. And you need to be getting enough to support your mood and your energy and all of those things throughout the day, especially if you are an active person and you're, taking walks, or you're doing whatever you might be doing during this time. You want to make sure you're fueling for that as well. And also with eating for your physical health, if you have any sort of, medical conditions that require, following certain dietary restrictions, adhering to those as well. And the final piece that I mentioned with this first little segment that I'm going to talk about was eating to support your mental health. And with this, I think I like to really think about like what's easiest for you in the moment. So there's going to be times where you maybe don't feel like what you're choosing to have is what diet culture or what someone might tell you is the appropriate food choice. And that's okay, right? So just allowing yourself to not stress over those little decisions, and feeling like free with food. I think that's a big thing that can help support your mental health with food choices. And there are certain nutrients that do support your mood and support your brain health. And so that's kind of what I'm going to transition into next, while being mindful that, you know, you have to kind of eat with whatever is going to make you feel good in that moment. And it might not always be these nutrients that I'm going to talk about that specifically enhance your brain function or enhance your mood. So just wanted to preface it with that first.
Mekenzie?
Oh,
yeah.
sorry, Madonna. I was just going to pause to see if anyone had any questions. Madonna, what were you going to say?
I was just going to ask Mekenzie if you may be able to speak to, or if you're planning to speak to, how people who might be on medications and how they need to sort of balance, or not medications, but even other directions from their physician, perhaps around food and around what they also might intuitively feel like eating. Like there's sometimes a battle there, I feel, between what they're telling you and what your body might be telling you. So could you speak to that perhaps as well at some point?
That's a really great question. And I think that could be very specific to the person, because there are some dietary recommendations that might come from your doctor that are absolutely necessary to follow. For example, if you have celiac disease, you really should not be eating gluten. It's not really like an option. But other parts that doctors might recommend, let's say like a lower sodium diet if you have high blood pressure. And I think there are ways that you can work around that while still eating intuitively. So I think some of those pieces are more one-on-one and case-by-case scenarios.
Is it more about kind of listening to your body and how your body's reacting if you're wanting to be more intuitive? I don't know if you're going to speak on that as well, you know. People get to understand what's going on with themselves, I suppose, in different foods.
Certainly. I think our bodies are really smart and they know what we want. And so if you're feeling great about certain food choices and they're making you feel really great and your doctor's telling you they shouldn't be, maybe that recommendation isn't correct and maybe your body is telling you the right thing, right? That's certainly possible. So I think it totally depends, but our bodies are very smart and they really do understand what it is that we need and what we want. So I think listening to your body is definitely a high priority.
Thank you. And are there any other questions or comments or thoughts from anybody else? Anything at all? You can write them in the chat box, or from any of the things that she shared, talking about foods that bring joy, foods that bring energy, helping to stabilize blood sugars. Honoring hunger is a huge part of what I heard in that as well, right? Not letting our bodies get totally ravenous and then being in that cycle. So yeah, are there any questions or thoughts or comments? It's okay if there aren't, but I just want to open up space for that. Love the emphasis that our bodies are so smart. Yes, exactly. Thanks, Melissa. Okay, great. Well, if there aren't any other questions, Mekenzie, you want to go into talking about the nutrients?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
So I'm going to start by talking about those macronutrients that I mentioned. So that's like carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. And then after that, we can talk about some more of the micronutrients, so the vitamins and the minerals. So first, I just want to mention that our brain is only 2% of our body weight, but it uses 20 to 30% of the energy that we give it. So our brains require a lot of the nutrition that we're putting into our body to function. And specifically, the source of fuel that our brains are looking for is glucose, which comes from carbohydrates. Carbohydrates break down to glucose, and glucose is the preferred energy source for our brains. So a lot of times we hear from diet culture, you know, follow a low carb diet or the ketogenic diet or things like that. And there are certain populations where that might be appropriate, but for our general advice, we need to remind ourselves that carbohydrates are really important. It's a preferred energy source for our brains. And also when we think about other recommendations, having a really colorful plate, that oftentimes means having a lot of fruits and vegetables, and that is giving us, those phytonutrients, the anti-inflammatory foods, the antioxidants that are really good for our brains and our bodies as well. And when you think about what those foods are, like fruits and vegetables that are colorful foods, those are carbohydrates. So I think trying to challenge that diet culture message and recognize that carbs are not evil. They really are necessary for our brains, our bodies, and to get those, those like antioxidant foods, those anti-inflammatory foods, those come from carbohydrates. So reminding ourselves of that too.
Mekenzie, there was a question that came in. Can I read it to you and you can integrate it into what you're saying maybe, or is that okay?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so Catherine asked, in terms of physical health, how do you know how much extra you need to boost your energy if you up your physical movements? So in terms of physical health, how do you know how much extra you need to boost your energy if you up your physical movements?
That's a good question. I was wondering the same.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So in terms of like adding exercise, this might mean, I think this is a good place where you can try and be intuitive with your eating and listening to what your body's telling you. So I think it is good to try and eat something before you move your body so that you know that you have that energy available for when you're expending energy in the activity. And then afterwards, after you finish activity, I think that's a really good time to check in with yourself and think about what is going to make me feel good after this exercise. What's going to make me feel back to like my baseline where I'm not feeling super drained from what I just did, where my mind is functioning great again, where I'm feeling hydrated. So all of those types of things, I think that's a good time to really check in with yourself. I also think there is evidence that it is important to get protein in for exercise to help build up muscle mass. So trying to incorporate some sort of protein food within a couple hours after exercise can also be really important. But in terms of how much and when, I think that can be something that you're listening to your body about. Does that answer the question?
Catherine, does that answer?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Okay. Oh, and I was just speaking about protein, so I'll continue on that with the brain health stuff that I was going to talk about. So protein, one of the functions is that they can act as neurotransmitters. That's a word that you're going to hear me use a couple times throughout this. So neurotransmitters are like chemical messengers within the brain. They're kind of talking to each other, communicating, sending these messages. So one function of proteins is to act as a neurotransmitter. Another two words that I'm going to mention a lot are serotonin and dopamine. So both of these are kind of like happy hormones, I would say. And if you have low levels of dopamine, you're more likely to feel bored, have like greater apathy, fatigue, low energy. So you want to have healthy amounts of dopamine. And then also low levels of serotonin, you can feel more depressed, you can have poor sleep, you can have increased aggressive behavior. So both of these are really important to have adequate amount in your body. So I just wanted to mention, so neurotransmitters, dopamine and serotonin, because they're going to come up a couple of times with what I'm speaking about going forward. So speaking of the proteins, there are a couple essential amino acids, which means these need to come from our diets. Anytime we use the word, most of the times when we use the word essential in nutrition, it means that our bodies can't make them on their own and that they need to come from our diets. So one essential amino acid is tryptophan, and tryptophan is involved in the production of serotonin. So that tells us that we need this adequate amount of protein to get the adequate amount of serotonin that our body wants to have for all of these good feelings that we need. And same with a different amino acid called tyrosine. So this is one that's involved in the production of dopamine. So again, showing us that adequate amounts of protein in our diet is really essential to feel okay, to feel good. So we can get these proteins from any animal source, has all of the essential amino acids. When we think about plant sources, it's a bit trickier, but there certainly are some plant sources where you can get these amino acids from. A complete source of a plant protein is soy. So you can get all of your essential amino acids from soy, also quinoa, and then some like nuts and seeds and grains are also sources. So that's a reason for protein being essential to brain health. The next macronutrient that I'm going to move on to is fats. So I think a lot of times people are familiar with one specific type of fatty acid that is really essential to our brain health. And I think you guys could probably all guess it right now. So omega-3 fatty acids, I'm sure we've all heard those before. Super important for our brains. So 60% of our brain is composed of fat. So it's really essential that we get a steady supply of dietary fat to keep our brain functioning appropriately. And specifically, these essential fats that I'm talking about are omega-3s and omega-6s. I think the reason that omega-6s get less hype is because we typically get enough of those in our diet as Americans. They're found in a lot of plant oils that are usually used for cooking, or they're in a lot of our processed foods that we eat. So typically most Americans get enough omega-6s, but omega-3s can sometimes be more challenging to get from our diet because those really come from those fatty fishes and nuts and seeds and some oils as well. But these omega-3s are super important for brain functioning. So they are part of the structure of our cell membranes, of the cell membrane in the brain cells. So they're really important for that communication that I talked about, like the neurotransmitters. So the cells talking to each other in the brain. They're also involved in the production of serotonin and dopamine. So very, very important for our brain health. And I like to mention some of the sources of fish because I think most people think of just salmon when we think about omega-3s and the fatty fish, but there are other fish that are high in omega-3s as well, including like mackerel, herring, sardines. Not sure if anyone has ventured into sardines, but they are a great source of omega-3s. Also, in nuts, like walnuts are a great source of omega-3s, flaxseed, chia seeds, and those are things that you can add into smoothies, or you can add into oatmeal, or you can bake them into breads. So those are things that are a little bit more versatile if you're not a huge fish fan. So there are certainly ways that you can kind of amp up your omega-3s in your diet without just eating salmon. They're also fortified into a lot of products these days, I think, because it's catching on as like a public health memo that we don't get enough. So they're oftentimes fortified into eggs, even milks these days. So I think they're becoming more popular because of the trend and the knowledge that they're so important for our brain health. Okay, so I'm going to move on to our micronutrients. Was there any questions about the proteins, the fats, the carbs?
Yeah, those are great questions. Yeah, any questions, comments, thoughts? Okay.
Okay, so there are a whole bunch of micronutrients that are super important for our brains. I'm going to talk about, I want to be mindful of time, so I'm going to talk about a few that I think really stand out to me and are ones that I hear a lot about and a lot of people ask questions about. So one of those is magnesium. So I feel like that's a big trend these days. A lot of people are wondering if they should take a magnesium supplement. And magnesium is very crucial for our brain health. It's involved in hundreds of enzymatic reactions, it's shown that people with higher levels of magnesium often have healthier amounts of serotonin. So there's a connection there. And oftentimes if people are deficient in magnesium, you might feel more anxious, you might have poor sleep, you might have constipation, irritability, fatigue. Those can all be signs of a magnesium deficiency. And it makes it kind of challenging because there's not really a good blood marker of a magnesium deficiency. So you kind of have to rely on those symptoms along with your dietary intake to figure out if you might be deficient in magnesium. But the cool thing is that a lot of studies have shown that people who are deficient in magnesium and have those symptoms can really feel a whole lot better by taking a magnesium supplement or by adding magnesium into their diet through foods. The tricky thing with magnesium supplements, and the reason why I wouldn't just say like, oh, everyone just go take a magnesium supplement, is because, first of all, the forms are really different. So if you take magnesium oxide, for example, you're likely to probably have diarrhea. It can definitely cause loose stools. So the form that you buy of magnesium is important. Generally, the form called magnesium glycinate tends to be gentler on the GI tract. But again, I think supplementation is something that you would want to work with someone one-on-one to figure out if it's necessary and what type and how much you should be taking.
Mekenzie, there's a quick question here. Can I go ahead and ask it?
Yeah.
It's from Elke. Can you take too much or use too much omega-3 intake?
That's a good question. It's really hard, I think, to get too much omega-3, but I would say if you are taking omega-3 supplements, I wouldn't take more than what's recommended on the bottle. But dietary-wise, it's really hard to get too much through your diet.
Okay.
And will you be sort of mentioning, Mekenzie, like with regards to magnesium, like what type of actual plant foods or foods that contain magnesium, or is that something you have?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Or any other kind of micronutrients that you mentioned, if you can mention any food related things that we can use rather than just supplements.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like food sources. Yeah.
Yeah. So some good sources of magnesium would be green leafy vegetables, whole grains, nuts, seeds. Bananas are a great source. Is there any other things that I've mentioned so far that I didn't mention food sources of? I may have skipped over.
I don't know. I don't think so.
No, that's fine.
Yeah, I don't think so. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Just, keep going. That's fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
What time would you like me to wrap this up so that we have time to, regroup at the end?
Yeah, maybe like 2 more minutes, 3 more minutes. Is that okay? Okay.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah. Okay,
so
great.
I'll just mention a couple more of these vitamins and minerals. Yeah. So vitamin D, I think, is another one that we hear about that's really important for our mood. There's a lot of studies that show lower levels of vitamin D are associated with increased feelings of depression. And vitamin D is something that is easily measured in our blood. So you can go to your doctor and ask them to test your levels of vitamin D. And if you are below a certain amount, they will definitely recommend a supplement. But in terms of food sources, vitamin D is found in like fortified milks, eggs, egg yolk specifically, and also those fatty fish are good sources of vitamin D too. So the same sources that I talked about for the omega-3s, like the salmon, the mackerel, the herring, those fatty fish are good sources of vitamin D as well. Yeah, but if you're eating fortified foods like cereals or grains or milk, oftentimes vitamin D is fortified into foods as well. I think one other that I will, or maybe I'll mention 2 others quickly. So one that I wanted to talk about was zinc. I think this one's important just because a lot of people don't think about getting zinc in their diet. And something interesting that I've noticed working on an inpatient eating disorder floor is that people are often deficient in zinc. And one way that you can notice if you are is you have a poor sense of taste. So if foods aren't tasting right to you, or maybe they're tasting metallic-y, that could be a sign that you're not getting enough zinc in your diet. So zinc comes mainly from meat sources, but it's also found in grains and vegetables. And if anyone likes oysters, oysters are the food with the highest amount of zinc per serving. So I recently became a fan of oysters, and I was pretty excited about it because I was like, oh, I'm getting in all my zinc. Yeah, and zinc is also something that I think is interesting right now because it plays a big role in our immune function as well. So with all that's going on in the world and the coronavirus, there's a lot of talk about zinc because it can kind of boost your immune system too.
That's great.
Yeah, we can stop there. There's tons of micronutrients I could speak about, but I think I hit on some of the really important ones.
I guess also too, Mekenzie, you know, before people sort of start either taking supplements on some of these things or, you know, eating up lots more of that food, is it best to get a blood test to be able to test some of them where you can first before you start taking any other supplements?
Absolutely.
Recommendation.
Yeah, I would always say if you're feeling like there might be something, like if you follow maybe a vegetarian diet or a vegan diet, or you're just feeling like you're not eating quite the variety that you could be, it's important to talk to your doctor about that and let them know that you're concerned, so that they can do those tests before you just start taking supplements. Absolutely. I wouldn't recommend anyone just go out and buy supplements after this. I just wanted to make people aware of the certain nutrients that really do play a big role in brain health.
Right.
And I think I like thinking about how all these different nutrients play a role in our brain, and it kind of gives us a reason to add more variety, to expand our diets a little bit, to experiment with new foods, just kind of, you know, a reason to diversify things and add to our diets, really.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. I just want to say thank you so much to Haley for sharing your personal practice. It was really inspiring, very moving. And Mekenzie, thank you for sharing your knowledge and your time and all the helpful information that you shared with us. And yeah, and thank you everybody for joining. Madonna, do you want to say anything?
No, just to say thank you again to everybody. I just am always enlightened further as these Bloominars go along, and really value both Haley and Menkenzie's contributions and everybody else just for showing up.
Thank you all again. Aloha
Thank you.
in Hawaii.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
Thank you
all.
everybody.